The courtroom's echoes. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Grace Harper, just 16 years old, stepped into the defense role she never expected. Her slight frame seemed lost amid the towering shelves of law books, the imposing mahogany furniture, and the formal crowd filling the gallery. Her fingers clutched a stack of notes, the pages slightly crumpled from hours of studying, her only shield against the tidal wave of doubt facing her. Judge Evelyn Torres, known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude, eyed Grace from the bench. The skeptical gaze she directed toward the teenage girl could have withered lesser souls. "Miss Harper," the judge began, her voice carrying both authority and condescension, "you seriously think you can defend yourself in a courtroom of this caliber against trained attorneys?" The murmurs rippled through the crowd like an electric current, spectators exchanging glances that ranged from pity to ridicule. Even the prosecuting attorney, William Crane, allowed himself a subtle smirk, his confidence bolstered by years of experience. Grace inhaled deeply, fighting the lump forming in her throat. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quivering but resolute, "I understand the odds are against me. But Statute 28 U.S.C.S.S. 1654 allows any individual to represent themselves. I have a right to be here, to defend myself, and I intend to do so to the best of my ability." A hush fell over the room. Even Judge Torres seemed momentarily caught off guard by the steel in Grace's words, but the judge quickly recovered, her tone brisk. "Very well. Let the record show that Miss Harper has elected to represent herself." She turned her attention to the jury, her gaze momentarily softening. "Members of the jury, this will be an unusual case. I trust you to give it your full attention and weigh the evidence fairly." As the opening remarks began, Grace's mind raced. Only a month ago, she was just another high school junior juggling math tests, babysitting her brother Liam, and dreaming about summer break. Now she was defending herself against charges that could derail her entire life. Flashback. The playground incident. The late afternoon sun painted the playground in hues of gold as Grace sat on a bench, scrolling through her phone. Her 10-year-old brother Liam, all boundless energy, scrambled across the monkey bars nearby. His laughter echoed in the crisp autumn air, momentarily easing Grace's worries. It had been a tough year, but moments like these reminded her why she fought so hard to keep their lives together. "Just a few more minutes, Liam," she called out. "We need to get home for dinner." "Okay," Liam replied, hanging upside down with a grin that tugged at Grace's heart. Suddenly, the peaceful scene shattered. A group of older teens strolled onto the playground, their loud laughter cutting through the quiet. Grace tensed as she recognized Ryan Matthews at the front of the pack. Known for his brash behavior, Ryan had a reputation for targeting kids smaller than himself. Grace's instincts kicked in as Ryan and his friends zeroed in on Liam. The boy, oblivious to their intentions, barely noticed when Ryan snatched his red baseball cap. "Hey, give that back," Liam protested, reaching for his cap as Ryan dangled it just out of reach. Grace was on her feet before she realized it. "Leave him alone," she shouted, striding toward the group. Her heart pounded, but she pushed her fear aside. Ryan turned, his smirk widening. "What are you going to do about it, big sister?" he taunted. Grace stood her ground. "Give the hat back. Now." Ryan chuckled, tossing the cap to one of his friends. They jeered as Liam tried unsuccessfully to grab it. Fury bubbled in Grace's chest. "I said, stop." Ryan stepped closer, his grin hardening into something more menacing. "Or what?" he sneered. Grace's hands balled into fists. "Just give it back," she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. Ryan's laugh echoed coldly as he gave her a light shove. "Relax, it's just a hat." The shove wasn't hard, but it was enough to push Grace's resolve over the edge. Without thinking, she shoved him back. Ryan staggered, his foot catching on a low bench. He flailed, lost his balance, and fell backward, his head striking the edge of a concrete planter with a sickening thud. Time froze. The playground, once filled with laughter, fell silent. Ryan lay motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His friends' expressions morphed from amusement to panic. "You pushed him," one of them shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Grace. "You did this on purpose." Grace stared in shock. "No, he pushed me first. I didn't mean." Her protests were drowned out as bystanders began pulling out their phones, dialing 911. Liam clung to her arm, his face pale with fear. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. Paramedics rushed to Ryan's side, while a police officer approached Grace. His expression was stern. "Miss, what happened here?" Grace's voice trembled. "I was protecting my brother. He shoved me first." Ryan's friends cut her off, their voices overlapping as they painted her as the aggressor. The officer frowned. "We'll need you to come with us to the station. You can explain there." "But I didn't," Grace began, but her words faltered as the officer produced handcuffs. Liam burst into tears. "Don't take her. She didn't do anything wrong." Grace knelt, hugging him tightly. "It's okay, Liam. Tell Mom. I'll be fine." As the officer led her away, Grace's heart sank. How had it come to this? All she had wanted was to protect her brother. Now she was being accused of assault, her future hanging in the balance. The beginning of the fight. The sharp buzz of fluorescent lights filled the sterile interrogation room where Grace sat, her wrists aching from the cuffs. Across the table, a stocky officer leafed through a manila folder. "Grace Harper," he said at last, his tone clipped. 16 years old, never been in trouble before. Guess today's your big debut." Grace clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry. "It was an accident," she said softly. "I didn't mean for him to get hurt." The officer's eyebrows rose. "An accident? You shoved a kid hard enough to put him in the hospital. That doesn't sound like an accident to me." "He pushed me first," Grace protested, her voice rising. "I was just trying to protect my brother." The officer leaned in, his expression hard. "Look, kid, Ryan Matthews is in critical condition. His parents want answers. This isn't just some schoolyard spat. You're facing serious charges, assault, maybe worse." Grace's stomach twisted. The weight of his words was suffocating. Assault. How could this be happening? Hours later, her mother, Karen Harper, burst into the police station. Her face, lined with exhaustion from working 2 jobs, was tight with worry. "Where's my daughter?" she demanded. "Interrogation room," the desk sergeant replied without looking up. Karen didn't wait for permission. She found Grace and pulled her into a fierce hug. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What happened?" Grace's voice cracked as she recounted the events. Karen's expression darkened. "We'll fight this," she said firmly. "No one's going to railroad my daughter." But when the public defender assigned to Grace's case arrived, his demeanor was anything but reassuring. "Look," he said, flipping through a file, "the evidence isn't in your favor. The best option is to take a plea deal." "Plea deal?" Karen snapped. "My daughter's innocent." The defender shrugged. "Innocence doesn't always matter. Trials are risky." Grace's resolve hardened. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I won't plead guilty. If no one else will fight for me, I'll do it myself." Karen stared at her, stunned, but Grace's mind was made up. She didn't have experience or a law degree, but she had something just as powerful: the truth, and she was determined to make it heard. Unearthing strength in a world of doubt. The air in the Harper household was thick with tension. Grace sat at the dining table, surrounded by a fortress of books, papers, and her laptop. The dim light from the single bulb overhead cast long shadows, but her focus was unwavering. Every page she read and every note she jotted was one step closer to proving her innocence. Karen, her mother, stood at the counter, wringing her hands. "Grace, are you sure about this? This isn't just a school debate. This is your life." Grace looked up, her face a mix of exhaustion and determination. Mom, I don't have a choice. The public defender isn't going to fight for me. If I don't do this, no one will. Karen sighed deeply. She wanted to believe in her daughter's ability to overcome the odds, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. At least let me get someone to help you. Maybe there's someone Who? Mom? Grace interrupted gently but firmly. We can't afford a lawyer, and the public defender has already written me off. It's me or no one. Karen sat down beside her, resting a hand on Grace's shoulder. You're so brave, Grace, but even the bravest people need help. Grace smiled faintly, her tired eyes betraying a flicker of gratitude. I know, Mom, and I'll take all the help I can get. But this is my fight. A lifeline in the library. The local library had always been a quiet sanctuary for Grace, a place where she could escape the chaos of life and dive into books. Now it had become her war room. She commandeered a corner table, piling it high with legal textbooks, printouts of relevant case law, and court transcripts. The library's atmosphere, normally serene, seemed to buzz with the weight of her mission. Mrs. Monroe, the librarian, approached her after a few days of watching Grace's relentless efforts. A retired paralegal with a kind heart and a sharp mind, she couldn't ignore the determined teenager buried under a mountain of legal documents. Grace, Mrs. Monroe began, pulling up a chair. I've seen you in here every day this week. What are you working on? Grace hesitated. She had learned to keep her guard up, especially with strangers. But something about Mrs. Monroe's calm demeanor put her at ease. I'm preparing for a trial, she admitted softly. I'm defending myself. Mrs. Monroe's eyebrows rose, but there was no mockery in her expression, only curiosity. That's quite the undertaking, she said, folding her hands in her lap. Do you know what you're up against? Grace nodded. I do, but I don't have another option. Mrs. Monroe leaned back, studying the girl in front of her. Finally, she said, You remind me of myself when I was your age. Stubborn and determined. Let me help you. Grace blinked, taken aback. Why would you do that? Mrs. Monroe smiled. Because everyone deserves a fair chance, and because I believe you have the courage to fight this. I'll help you navigate the legal system. From that day forward, Mrs. Monroe became an invaluable ally. She taught Grace how to use legal databases, showed her how to structure her defense, and helped her draft motions. Together, they combed through the prosecution's case, searching for weaknesses. The cracks began to show. After hours of reviewing witness statements, Grace began to notice something. Inconsistencies. Ryan's friends, who had testified that she pushed him unprovoked, couldn't seem to keep their stories straight. One claimed she had screamed at Ryan, while another said she barely raised her voice. One said Ryan flew backward, but another described a minor stumble. See this? Grace said, pointing to the statements spread across the table. They're contradicting each other. Mrs. Monroe nodded. Good. These inconsistencies are exactly what you need to highlight in court. They create doubt, and doubt can sway a jury. Encouraged by this discovery, Grace worked late into the night, preparing her cross-examinations. She imagined standing in court, facing each witness, and calmly unraveling their stories. It was daunting, but the thought of exposing the truth kept her going. The schoolyard trials. While Grace fought her legal battle, she faced another kind of trial at school. Word of her arrest had spread, and the students were ruthless. Whispers followed her through the hallways, cruel memes circulated on social media, and some classmates openly called her a criminal. Here comes the psycho, one boy muttered as she passed, loud enough for her to hear. Grace kept her head down, her fists clenched. She had learned to tune out the noise, but it wasn't easy. The isolation stung. Once a friendly and outgoing student, she now ate lunch alone, her tray untouched as she pored over her notes. But not everyone turned their back on her. One day, her best friend, Mia, slid into the seat across from her in the cafeteria. Hey, Maya said softly. Grace looked up, surprised. I thought you didn't want to be seen with me." Mia shrugged. "I don't care what they think. You're my friend." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Thanks, Mia." Mia smiled. "You're going to win this, Grace. I know you will. A glitch or a cover-up?" As Grace built her case, she hit a major roadblock. The police informed her that the playground's security cameras had malfunctioned on the day of the incident, and no footage was available. "A glitch," Grace repeated, her voice rising with frustration. "The one thing that could prove what really happened just conveniently doesn't exist." "I'm sorry," the officer said, sounding anything but. "There's nothing we can do." Grace slammed the phone down, her anger bubbling over. "How is this fair?" she cried to Karen. "They have everything stacked against me." Karen hugged her tightly. "I know, sweetheart. But you've already come so far. Don't give up now." Building the case. One evening, as Grace sifted through court documents, she came across something interesting. Ryan Matthews' disciplinary record from school. It revealed a history of aggressive behavior and altercations, including one incident where he provoked a classmate and then claimed to be the victim. "Mom, look at this," Grace said, holding up the file. "Ryan has a pattern of starting fights and blaming others. This could be huge." Karen frowned. "Will the court even allow it?" Grace thought for a moment. "If I can show it's relevant to what happened at the park, they might." She brought the evidence to Mrs. Monroe the next day. The librarian was cautious but optimistic. "This is a strong angle," she said, "but you'll need to tie it directly to your case. Don't just suggest he's a troublemaker. Prove it's part of a pattern." The first victory. When Grace presented her findings to the court, the prosecution immediately objected. "Your Honor," Crane said, "this is irrelevant and prejudicial." Grace stood, her voice steady. "Your Honor, this evidence goes to Ryan Matthews' credibility. It shows a consistent pattern of behavior that aligns with what happened at the park." Judge Torres considered for a moment before nodding. "I'd allow it." It was a small victory, but it bolstered Grace's confidence. As she returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of the jury. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, gave her a subtle nod. For the first time, Grace felt like she had a chance. But the battle was far from over. The trial was only beginning, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Yet, as she sat at the defense table, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't fighting alone. The tides of the courtroom. The third day of the trial dawned with a cold, unrelenting drizzle that mirrored Grace Harper's inner turmoil. As the courtroom came into view, its imposing columns and the steady hum of reporters waiting outside reinforced the gravity of her situation. Cameras flashed as Grace stepped out of the car with her mother by her side, Karen's protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. The sea of reporters jostled for position, their shouted questions cutting through the morning air like knives. "Grace, do you believe you can win this case on your own?" "Karen, how does it feel to watch your daughter defend herself? Any regrets about not hiring a lawyer?" Karen raised her hand to shield Grace, but the teenager walked forward, her head held high. "No comment," Grace said firmly, keeping her focus ahead. It was a phrase she'd learned to repeat like a mantra over the past week. Inside the courtroom. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Spectators filled every available seat, drawn by the media's portrayal of Grace as either a misguided teen or a cunning criminal. Grace ignored the stares and whispers, focusing on the defense table where her notes and evidence were neatly laid out. Judge Evelyn Torres entered, her gavel striking with authority. "Court is now in session. The prosecution may call their next witness." William Crane rose from his seat, his suit impeccably tailored, his demeanor cool and calculated. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Megan Daniels to the stand." Grace's heart sank as Megan, Ryan Matthews' girlfriend, confidently strode to the witness stand. Her polished appearance and calm demeanor gave her an air of credibility, and Grace braced herself for what was to come. A web of lies. Megan swore the oath and sat down, her eyes briefly meeting Grace's before darting away. Crane began his questioning, his tone warm and inviting. "Megan, how long have you known Ryan Matthews?" "Over a year," Megan replied. "We've been dating for most of that time." "And in that time, have you ever witnessed any interactions between Ryan and Grace Harper?" Megan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, several times. Grace always seemed intense. She had this aggressive energy, especially when it came to her brother." Crane nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Can you describe one such interaction?" Megan took a deep breath, her voice tinged with drama. "It was in the school cafeteria. Grace accused Ryan of bullying her brother, and she got right in his face. She threatened him, saying he'd regret it if he didn't back off." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Grace felt her chest tighten. That wasn't true. She'd never had any direct confrontation with Ryan until the day of the park. Crane paced slowly in front of the jury. "So, in your experience, would you say Grace Harper has a history of aggressive behavior toward Ryan?" "Yes," Megan said firmly. "Ryan always said she had a temper. And after what happened, I believe it." The cross-examination. When it was Grace's turn to cross-examine, she rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She took a deep breath and approached the witness stand, meeting Megan's gaze head-on. "Megan," Grace began, her tone calm and measured, "you testified that I threatened Ryan in the cafeteria. Were you there when this supposed argument happened?" Megan faltered, her confident demeanor slipping just slightly. "Well, no, but Ryan told me about it." "So your testimony is based entirely on what Ryan said, not on what you witnessed personally?" Grace asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yes, but—" "And you said this argument happened in the cafeteria. Can you tell us the date?" Grace pressed. Megan hesitated. "It was sometime in September, I think." Grace allowed a small smile to creep onto her face. "That's interesting because Ryan's friends testified yesterday that the incident at the park was the first time I confronted him. How do you explain that?" Megan's face reddened, her composure slipping further. I don't know. Maybe they forgot." "Or maybe," Grace said, her voice growing firmer, "this supposed argument in the cafeteria never happened at all, and you're just repeating the story Ryan told you to make me look bad." "Objection." Crane's voice cut through the tension. "The defense is badgering the witness." Judge Torres raised an eyebrow. "Sustained. Miss Harper, watch your tone." Grace nodded, stepping back. "No further questions, Your Honor." The video analyst. Next, the prosecution called a forensic video analyst to testify about the playground footage. Crane's strategy was clear: to discredit the video as inconclusive. The analyst explained how the grainy quality and the partially obstructed view made it impossible to definitively determine what had happened at the critical moment when Ryan fell. Crane leaned in, his voice smooth. "Would you say that the video provides definitive proof of the defendant's innocence?" "No," the analyst replied. "The angle and obstructions make it impossible to discern intent." Grace's jaw tightened. She knew Crane was twisting the narrative, using the video's limitations to cast doubt on her defense. Grace's turn. When it was her turn to address the video, Grace approached the jury with confidence. "Members of the jury," she began, "the prosecution wants you to believe that because the video doesn't show every second, it's meaningless. But let's focus on what it does show." She gestured toward the screen where a still frame of Ryan and his friends taunting Liam was displayed. "You can see Ryan and his friends surrounding my brother, taking his hat, and refusing to give it back. You can see me stepping in to protect him. Does this look like a peaceful group being attacked without provocation?" The jury murmured softly, and Grace pressed on. "Yes, the view is obstructed at the moment Ryan falls. But the context is clear. I wasn't acting out of aggression. I was protecting my brother." She returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but she caught a glimmer of something on the faces of the jury. Doubt. Crane had planted seeds of skepticism, but she was beginning to plant seeds of her own. A new witness. As the court recessed for the day, Mrs. Monroe approached Grace with a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Grace, I found someone who might be able to help you." Grace frowned. "Who?" "An elderly man named Arthur Thompson. He's at the park almost every day, feeding the birds. He says he saw the entire incident and is willing to testify." Grace's breath caught. A new witness. It was risky to introduce testimony so late in the trial, but it could be the break she needed. "Can he be here tomorrow?" Mrs. Monroe nodded. "He's hesitant, but I convinced him. He knows it's important." Grace felt a surge of hope, tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow could make or break her case. As she walked out of the courthouse that evening, she looked up at the cloudy sky, a single thought running through her mind. "The truth is my only weapon, and I'll wield it until the end." The witness who changed everything. The courtroom was a hive of anticipation as the fourth day of Grace Harper's trial began. News of a potential new witness had spread like wildfire, and the gallery was packed with spectators eager to see what might unfold. The media frenzy outside had doubled overnight, their flashing cameras and pointed questions creating a cacophony of chaos that Grace had learned to block out. She entered the courtroom with her head held high, flanked by her mother, Karen, and the ever-reliable Mrs. Monroe. Karen gave her daughter's hand a reassuring squeeze before taking her seat in the gallery. Mrs. Monroe whispered, "Remember, Grace, stay calm and composed. This could tip the scales in your favor." Grace nodded, her heart pounding. Today could change everything. Introducing Mr. Thompson. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Evelyn Torres entered the courtroom, her gavel striking with authority. The usual proceedings unfolded, but the air was charged with curiosity when Grace stood to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "the defense would like to call Mr. Arthur Thompson to the stand. Mr. Thompson was present at the park on the day of the incident and has first-hand knowledge of what occurred." William Crane shot to his feet, his tone sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has had ample time to present witnesses. Introducing a new one at this stage is a blatant attempt to derail the prosecution's case." Grace responded before the judge could speak. "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson only came forward yesterday. His testimony is critical to understanding the truth of what happened that day." Judge Torres regarded Grace thoughtfully before turning her gaze to Crane. "Mr. Crane, while I understand your concern, the court's duty is to ensure that all relevant evidence is considered. I'll allow it. Miss Harper, call your witness." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery as the bailiff escorted an elderly man to the stand. Arthur Thompson moved slowly but steadily, his age visible in the lines on his face, but not in the clarity of his gaze. He was dressed in a modest suit, his hands clasped tightly around the brim of a flat cap. After being sworn in, Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and sat upright, meeting Grace's gaze with a calm confidence that eased some of her tension. The testimony. "Mr. Thompson," Grace began, stepping forward, "can you tell the court where you were on the afternoon of the incident at the park?" Thompson nodded. "I was sitting on my usual bench near the playground, feeding the birds. I've been going there every day for years." "And what did you observe that day?" Grace asked. The elderly man's expression grew serious. "I saw a group of older boys surrounding a younger one near the monkey bars. They were teasing him, took his hat, and wouldn't leave him alone. The boy looked scared, so I kept watching to make sure things didn't get out of hand." Grace gestured toward the gallery where her brother, Liam, sat with Karen. "Do you recognize that boy?" Thompson's gaze followed hers, and he nodded. "That's him, the little fella with the red baseball cap." Liam sat up straighter, his eyes wide with hope. "What happened next?" Grace prompted. "A girl came over." He paused, nodding at Grace. "You, Miss Harper, you told those boys to leave the kid alone. You weren't yelling, but you were firm." protective. Grace's voice remained calm, though her pulse quickened. And how did the boys respond? Their leader, Ryan, I think his name was, stepped toward you, like he was trying to intimidate you. He raised his hand as if he was going to shove you. The gallery erupted in gasps, and Crane immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Judge Torres raised a hand. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Thompson. Thompson straightened. It's not speculation, ma'am. I saw it plain as day. Ryan's shoelaces were untied, and when he stepped forward, he tripped over them. That's why he fell backward. No one pushed him. Cross-examination. Crane's polished demeanor betrayed a hint of irritation as he approached the stand. Mr. Thompson, he began smoothly, how far were you sitting from the incident? About 30 feet, Thompson replied. And you expect the court to believe that from that distance, you could see untied shoelaces on a moving teenager? Crane's tone was dripping with skepticism. Thompson didn't flinch. I've got sharp eyes, Mr. Crane. And I pay attention. Ryan's shoes were flopping around the whole time he was walking. Crane pressed on, his voice growing sharper. And yet, the prosecution's witnesses, who were much closer, testified that the defendant shoved Ryan. Are you saying they're lying? Thompson tilted his head thoughtfully. I'm saying people tend to see what they want to see, especially when it benefits them. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, and Crane's lips thinned. No further questions. The turning point. As Mr. Thompson stepped down, Grace felt a flicker of hope. His testimony had introduced a critical alternative to the prosecution's narrative. For the first time, she felt like the truth was beginning to shine through the cracks. But Crane wasn't finished. Your Honor, he said, rising from his seat, the prosecution has just received information that casts doubt on Mr. Thompson's credibility. Grace's stomach dropped as Crane produced a file. Mr. Thompson has no documented training in eyewitness observation and no record of ever providing testimony in a legal proceeding. His claims, while compelling, are unverified and should be taken with skepticism. Grace quickly rose to her feet. Your Honor, Mr. Thompson's testimony is based on first-hand observation. His lack of formal credentials doesn't invalidate what he saw. Judge Torres held up a hand to silence them both. The jury will weigh the credibility of Mr. Thompson's testimony. For now, we'll proceed. Grace's growing confidence. During a recess, Grace sat with Mrs. Monroe in the courthouse hallway. The older woman patted Grace's hand. You handled that well. Don't let Crane rattle you. I know, Grace said, exhaling slowly. But I can feel how much he's working to discredit me. It's like every small win we get, he's right there to tear it down. Mrs. Monroe smiled faintly. That's his job, Grace. But you've done something he didn't expect. You've made people question his narrative. That's power. As the trial resumed, Grace stood to deliver her arguments for the day. She summarized Mr. Thompson's testimony, highlighted the inconsistencies in the prosecution's witnesses, and reiterated the reasonable doubt that had been planted. Crane responded with his usual confidence, but for the first time, Grace noticed something, a flicker of frustration behind his polished exterior, a moment of solidarity. When the court adjourned for the day, Grace walked out to the courtyard where Liam and Karen waited. Liam ran up to her, his face glowing with pride. You were amazing, Grace, he said, wrapping his arms around her waist. Karen nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. You've come so far, sweetheart. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. As the sun set, casting golden light over the courthouse steps, Grace felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed she might actually win. In her heart, she knew one thing. Truth had a way of cutting through even the darkest clouds. All she had to do was keep pushing forward. The battle for truth. The fifth day of the trial brought a heightened tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Grace Harper sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly as she reviewed her notes for what felt like the 1000th time. Today was the day she would confront the prosecution's narrative head-on. She had no choice but to rise above every obstacle Crane threw her way, every subtle jab and twist of the truth. Her mother, Karen, sat in the gallery, her face lined with worry, but radiating unwavering support. Liam, too young to understand the legal intricacies, but old enough to grasp the gravity of the situation, sat beside her, clutching a drawing he had made for Grace, a superhero standing tall in a courtroom. "All rise." The bailiff called, and Judge Evelyn Torres entered, her gavel striking with authority. The jury filed in, their expressions guarded but attentive. Grace felt a surge of determination. This was her moment to show them the truth. The prosecution's closing salvo. William Crane rose, his movements slow and deliberate as he approached the jury. His confidence was unshaken, his demeanor polished. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm yet commanding. "This case is not about whether Grace Harper is a good person or whether she loved her brother. It's about whether her actions caused serious harm to another young man." He paced in front of the jury, gesturing toward Ryan Matthews' empty chair. "Ryan isn't here to tell his side of the story because he's still recovering from his injuries that were inflicted by Grace Harper. The evidence shows that her push was not a defensive act, but an act of aggression." Crane's voice grew sharper, his words cutting. "The defense has tried to distract you with inconsistencies and alternate theories, but the facts remain. Ryan Matthews is in critical condition, and the defendant caused it. Justice demands accountability." He turned back to his table, his face impassive as he took his seat. The gallery murmured softly, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Grace's last stand. Grace rose, her legs trembling but her resolve firm. She glanced at the jury, her gaze steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear but earnest. "I'm not a lawyer. I don't have years of training or experience like Mr. Crane, but I do have the truth." She paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "This trial has been about more than just what happened that day in the park. It's been about whether we're willing to look beyond appearances and ask ourselves what really happened." Grace gestured toward the still frame of the video footage displayed on the screen behind her. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. Ryan Matthews and his friends were taunting my brother, taking his hat, and refusing to leave him alone. I didn't approach them out of anger. I approached them out of fear for my brother." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Ryan stepped toward me. He tripped because his shoelaces were untied. Mr. Thompson, a man with no reason to lie, saw it happen. Yet the prosecution wants you to believe that I acted out of aggression. Grace's voice grew stronger, her passion shining through. "But ask yourselves, does that make sense? If I truly intended to harm Ryan, why would I stay and try to explain myself? Why would I fight so hard to tell my side of the story? The answer is simple, because I didn't hurt Ryan. I was trying to protect my brother." She turned to the jury, her eyes filled with sincerity. "You hold my future in your hands. All I ask is that you look at the evidence, listen to the witnesses, and decide for yourselves. Is there reasonable doubt? If there is, I trust you to do the right thing." As she returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of the jury. Some of them looked thoughtful, their expressions softening. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a glimmer of hope, a shocking revelation. As the court prepared for closing arguments, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A young man burst through the doors, his face pale and his movements frantic. It was one of Ryan Matthews' friends, Justin. "Your Honor," Justin called out, his voice trembling. "I need to speak. I have something to say." The courtroom erupted into chaos, spectators whispering and reporters scribbling furiously. Judge Torres banged her gavel. "Order. Young man, who are you, and why are you interrupting this trial?" Justin stepped forward, his hands shaking. "I'm Justin Parker. I was at the park that day. I lied during my testimony. The gallery gasped, and Grace felt her heart skip a beat. She exchanged a glance with Mrs. Monroe, who nodded subtly. Judge Torres' expression hardened. "Approach the bench, Mr. Parker. If you're going to make a statement, it will be under oath." The bailiff swore Justin in, and he took the stand, visibly nervous but resolute. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice cracking. "I lied because I was scared. Ryan told us to say that Grace pushed him. He said it would make things easier if we all stuck to the same story." Crane shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Judge Torres cut him off. "Sit down, Mr. Crane. I want to hear this." Justin continued, tears streaming down his face. "Ryan was the one who started everything. He took Liam's hat and wouldn't give it back. Grace was just trying to protect her brother. Ryan tripped on his own shoelaces. She didn't push him." The turning point. Grace sat frozen, her mind racing. Justin's confession was a game-changer, but it also felt too good to be true. Why now? Why confess at the 11th hour? When the court recessed, Justin approached Grace in the hallway. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't keep lying. It wasn't fair." Grace studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you. It means a lot." As they returned to the courtroom, Grace felt a surge of hope. Justin's testimony, combined with the video footage and Mr. Thompson's account, had created a mountain of reasonable doubt. The truth was finally coming to light. Closing the day. As the court adjourned for the day, Karen pulled Grace into a tight hug. "You were amazing," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. Grace smiled faintly, exhaustion settling in. "It's not over yet, Mom." Mrs. Monroe joined them, her expression warm. "You've done more than anyone thought possible, Grace. No matter what happens, you've shown incredible courage." Outside, the media swarmed, their cameras and microphones thrust toward Grace as she exited the courthouse. "Grace, how do you feel about Justin Parker's confession? Do you think it will change the outcome?" Grace paused, her gaze steady. "I believe in the truth, and I believe the jury will see it." As she climbed into the car, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The trial wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the weight of the world easing from her shoulders. The truth had found its voice, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The ripple effect. The courtroom buzzed with speculation as people filed out, whispers filling the air like a rising tide. Grace sat silently in the car, staring out the window as they left the courthouse. Justin Parker's unexpected confession replayed in her mind, his words a lifeline she hadn't anticipated. But with hope came uncertainty. Would the jury see his honesty, or would Crane succeed in discrediting him? Karen glanced at her daughter, her concern evident. "Grace, are you okay?" "I don't know," Grace admitted softly, finally turning to face her mother. "It feels like we finally cracked something open, but it could still go either way. Crane won't let Justin's confession stand without a fight." Karen reached out, taking Grace's hand in hers. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you. You've fought harder than anyone should ever have to, and you've done it with courage." Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks, Mom." The defense prepares. That evening, Grace and Mrs. Monroe worked late into the night, reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, and every angle of the case. They anticipated Crane's next move. He would almost certainly challenge Justin's credibility and attempt to undermine his confession. "Crane will argue that Justin's sudden change of heart is suspicious," Mrs. Monroe said, her voice calm and deliberate as she sipped her tea. "We need to show the jury why his testimony matters." Grace nodded, her brow furrowed as she jotted notes in her increasingly cluttered notebook. Justin said he was scared of Ryan. If we can connect that fear to Ryan's history of manipulation and aggression, it'll make his confession more believable. Exactly, Mrs. Monroe agreed. We also need to emphasize the consistency between Justin's confession and the other evidence, the video footage, Mr. Thompson's testimony. If we frame this right, it'll strengthen your case. The prosecution strikes back. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Reporters jostled for space, their cameras clicking furiously as Grace entered. The atmosphere was thick with tension as everyone waited for Crane's response to the bombshell testimony. "Your Honor," Crane began, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "The prosecution requests a hearing to evaluate the credibility of Justin Parker's testimony. This last-minute confession raises serious questions about motive and reliability." Judge Torres frowned slightly, but nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Crane." Crane called Justin to the stand once again, his demeanor cold and precise. "Mr. Parker, why did you wait until now to come forward with this information?" Justin fidgeted, his hands clasping and unclasping in his lap. "I was scared. Ryan told us what to say, and I didn't want to go against him." "Scared of what, exactly?" Crane pressed. "Ryan isn't here to threaten you." Justin hesitated, then said quietly, "Ryan's intimidating. He has a way of making people do what he wants. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I told the truth." Crane's eyes narrowed. "So we're supposed to take your word that Ryan orchestrated this supposed lie? A young man who is currently unable to defend himself because of the defendant's actions." Justin looked down, his confidence wavering under Crane's relentless questioning. "I know it sounds bad, but I'm telling the truth." Crane turned to the jury, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the problem with last-minute revelations. They're unreliable, unsubstantiated, and designed to create doubt where none should exist." Grace's counterattack. When it was Grace's turn to question Justin, she approached the stand with calm determination. She knew she had to repair the damage Crane had inflicted and reinforce Justin's credibility. "Justin," she began, her voice steady, "can you explain why you decided to come forward now, despite your fear?" Justin met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I couldn't keep lying. It didn't feel right, especially when I saw how much Grace was fighting to prove the truth. I knew I had to do the right thing." Grace nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "And when you say Ryan was intimidating, can you give the court an example of how he influenced you and others?" Justin hesitated but then said, "Ryan liked to have control. He'd make fun of people, call them weak if they didn't do what he wanted. He made it clear that if we didn't stick to the story, there'd be consequences." "Did Ryan ever threaten you directly?" Grace asked. "Not in so many words," Justin admitted, "but you didn't have to be told outright. Everyone knew what would happen if you crossed him." Grace turned to the jury, her voice firm. "Justin's confession aligns with the evidence you've already seen. It's consistent with the video footage, with Mr. Thompson's testimony, and with the truth I've been fighting to tell since this trial began." She paused, letting her words sink in. Justin didn't come forward to save himself. He came forward because he knew it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of courage this case needs. The jury listens. As Grace returned to her seat, she glanced at the jury. Their expressions ranged from thoughtful to uncertain, but she saw something new in their eyes, a willingness to listen. Judge Torres called for a brief recess, and Grace stepped out into the hallway, where Mrs. Monroe was waiting. "You did well," Mrs. Monroe said, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're making them see the truth." "I hope so," Grace replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's still so much at stake." An emotional close. When the court reconvened, Judge Torres announced that closing arguments would begin the following day. Grace felt a wave of relief, but also a surge of anxiety. The end was near, but the final hurdle loomed large. As she left the courthouse, Liam ran up to her, holding out his drawing. "Look, Grace, I made it better," he said, showing her a revised version of his superhero drawing. This time, the superhero was surrounded by stars, her cape billowing triumphantly. Grace knelt, pulling Liam into a hug. "Thanks, buddy. I'll keep fighting, okay? For you." As they walked to the car, Karen wrapped an arm around Grace's shoulders. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already won in my eyes." Grace nodded, her determination renewed. Tomorrow would be the final battle. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family, for the truth, and for justice. The final verdict. The final day of the trial dawned cold and gray, as if the weather itself mirrored the weight of the moment. Grace Harper stood in front of the mirror in her small bedroom, her reflection a mix of exhaustion and determination. Today, it would all end. Today, the jury would decide her fate. Downstairs, her mother Karen paced nervously, while Liam sat at the kitchen table, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "Another drawing for me?" Grace asked, descending the stairs. Liam looked up, beaming. "Yeah, it's you winning the case. You're like a lawyer's superhero." Grace smiled faintly, tussling his hair. "Thanks, buddy. I'll do my best." Karen hugged her tightly before they left. "Whatever happens today, I'm proud of you. You've shown everyone just how strong you are." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. She had come too far to falter now. The closing arguments. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air electric with anticipation. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness the final chapter of the trial that had captivated the community. Judge Evelyn Torres entered, her gavel striking the wood with authority. "Court is now in session. We will proceed with closing arguments." William Crane stood first, his suit immaculate and his demeanor as polished as ever. He approached the jury with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and measured, "this case is about accountability. Ryan Matthews is not here today to tell his side of the story because of the actions of Grace Harper. The defense has worked tirelessly to distract you, to sow doubt, but the facts remain. Ryan was injured, and Grace caused it." He gestured toward the gallery, where Ryan's parents sat, their faces etched with worry. "This family deserves justice. The community deserves justice, and justice demands that you hold Grace Harper accountable for her actions." Crane paused for dramatic effect before returning to his seat. The gallery buzzed softly, the weight of his words settling heavily in the room. Then it was Grace's turn. Grace speaks from the heart. Grace rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her notes. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the faces of the jury. These 12 strangers held her future in their hands, and she had one final chance to show them the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside her. "This trial has been the hardest experience of my life. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a 16-year-old girl who wanted to protect her brother." She gestured toward Liam, who sat in the gallery clutching his latest drawing. "That's Liam. He's 10 years old. He's kind, smart, and full of energy. On the day of the incident, he was being bullied. Ryan Matthews and his friends took his hat, taunted him, and wouldn't leave him alone. I stepped in to protect him, like any big sister would." Grace paused, letting the silence stretch. Ryan's injury was an accident. He tripped over his own shoelaces. You've seen the video, heard the testimony. And even Ryan's own friend, Justin, admitted the truth. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The prosecution wants you to believe that I'm a threat, that I acted out of aggression. But ask yourselves, does that make sense? Why would I risk everything, my future, my family, just to hurt someone? The answer is simple. I wouldn't." She stepped closer to the jury, her gaze unwavering. "This case isn't just about me. It's about justice. And justice isn't about punishing someone who's innocent. Justice is about finding the truth. And the truth is, I didn't hurt Ryan Matthews. I was trying to protect my brother." Grace took a deep breath, her final words hanging in the air. "I trust you to see the truth. I trust you to do what's right." She returned to her seat, her heart pounding. The gallery was silent, the weight of her words lingering like a tangible force. The jury deliberates. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in a tense hush. Grace sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Karen reached over, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "You did everything you could," she whispered. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The courtroom remained full, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters whispered into their microphones, updating their audiences on every small development. Finally, the bailiff entered. "The jury has reached a verdict." Grace's heart leaped into her throat as the jurors filed back in, their expressions unreadable. She rose to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" Judge Torres asked. A juror, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The verdict. The courtroom was so silent that Grace could hear the rapid beating of her own heart. She held her breath as the juror unfolded the slip of paper in her hands. "In the matter of the State versus Grace Harper, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hit Grace like a tidal wave. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the edge of the table for support. The gallery erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Karen threw her arms around Grace, sobbing with relief. Liam, beaming from ear to ear, held up his drawing for everyone to see. "I told you, Grace, you're a superhero." Judge Torres banged her gavel, calling for order. "The defendant is free to go. Court is adjourned." The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, Grace was greeted by a throng of reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her. Karen shielded her daughter as they pushed through the crowd, but Grace paused, turning to face them. "I just want to say one thing," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for the truth. No one should ever be afraid to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is." The crowd erupted into applause as Grace and her family made their way to the car. A new chapter. That night, back in the quiet of their home, Grace sat at the kitchen table with Liam, reviewing his drawings. "You really think I'm a superhero?" she asked, smiling. Liam nodded emphatically. "You're my superhero. You saved me." Karen joined them, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You saved all of us, Grace. You reminded us what it means to fight for what's right." As the family shared a quiet dinner, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The battle was over, and she had emerged victorious. Not just for herself, but for the truth. Her story wasn't just one of survival. It was a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of believing in oneself.